Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth and final lecture in Chapter 14. And actually, our last lecture really dealing with the medieval period. When we kind of come back to Middle Ages Europe, we're going to kind of just talk about um, kind of what were the causes that led to the Renaissance. So, this is kind of our last section in talking about the medieval period, really from 500 to 1500. So, let's get started here. Obviously, the two big subjects here are going to be the Hundred Years' War and the Black Plague. And we'll do some activities looking specifically at the plague and so forth. All right. So, set the stage. By the 1300s, there are a lot of there's a lot going on in Europe, and the 1300s is marked by really natural disasters and human-made disasters. So basically, the Black Death and war. In particular, the Hundred Years' War is going to be the main one that we're going to focus on here, as the title of the lecture states. Now, this epidemic that's going to go across Europe is going to kill millions, and it's going to change the economies of Europe. It's going to change Europe forever, and really, it's going to change world history. And you can see there's a lot of comparisons, and we'll, depending on how things go, and so forth. Because I'm videotaping this lecture here in late July. We'll see if we can make some comparisons and do some things with, since it's an epidemic, the Black Death with what we're seeing today or what we've seen in other examples, like in 1919 or what have you. So we'll kind of see what we can do with that. And then lastly, England and France, they're going to fight these wars to gain not only power, but try to improve upon their lands and so forth. And really, out of these wars, in particular the Hundred Years' War, you're going to see the modern England and modern France emerge, much more so than kind of what we just talked about in the previous lecture, with the development of England and France. But out of these wars, you're going to see these two countries take off and establish a rivalry that will play itself out really for the next 500-600 years, and still plays a role to this day. All right, now one thing that we have to talk about is, outside of the plague and outside of the Hundred Years' War, is during this time there's some religious change, and in the 1300, Pope Boniface VIII tells King Philip IV of France that he must obey him. Philip says no, and I'm the king. I don't answer to you. He actually captures the Pope and puts him on trial in France. But the Pope is rescued. Okay, so this is kind of a real big, like, kind of flashpoint in terms of power between, clash of power between the church and a king. Now, Boniface, even though he's rescued, he dies several months later. And this is really the last time a pope pushed control of a king. And there's really this last time that there's a significant butting of heads. And what ultimately ends up happening is the College of Cardinals selects Clement V as Pope in 1305, and the church base, which is normally in Rome and still is to this day, for a time moves to Avignon in France because of the linkages to the French king. Now, the church ends up getting weakened by this move, mainly because it's off of its power base or power center, and then two, it's under more of a control of an actual state. So it's going to be weakened. Now, what ultimately ends up happening is Gregory the 11th in 1379 dies in Rome. The Cardinals, the College of Cardinals, ends up choosing Urban VI as the next pope. Well, he's an Italian. The Cardinals again choose several months later Clement VII. Then what ends up happening is these two popes are essentially popes at the same time. Now, I'm not going to get into that detail why, mainly because it's not for this course, but just know what ultimately ends up happening is you have two popes, one's Italian, one's French. They are both selected by the College of Cardinals, one in Rome, one in France, and they excommunicate each other. And this leads to what is known as the Great Schism. The church is divided. The power structure is all messed up. And it even gets worse in 1414. There's another pope elected. So you actually have three Catholic popes or men that are called popes at the same time. It's a nightmare. It's a mess. So what ultimately ends up happening is there's a council called at Constance that organizes, and they force all three to resign. And what they end up doing is they come back together, discuss, and in 1417, the Great Schism ends when the College of Cardinals selects as Pope Martin V. And that ends the rule of the Catholic Church by more than one Pope. All right, so this is kind of, you can see what this divide did. If you look at this map, purple were the areas that allied themselves to the Pope in Avignon, which is in southern France here. And obviously the French lands did that. You have a strong connection between France and Scotland, and then as well as France and Spain. Then you have the allegiance to Rome. Now, typically it's really the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, we've talked about that connection between northern Italy and the German peoples. That connection there is why that's linked. You have a closer connection to in England with that Pope in Rome and so forth. That's those allegiances. You have Eastern Orthodox Christianity here in blue, the Islamic states here in kind of the tannish yellow, and then the areas of shifting allegiances. And this is because of the feudal breakup of Central Europe. But this is basically, you can see there's going to be some pushback and division, not just from a religious standpoint, but politically as well. So you have challenges that actually develop to the church during this period, obviously because of how things are so broken up. John Wycliffe preaches that Jesus Christ is the head of the church, not the Pope. So looking at an actual figure within the religion, not a person that's alive right now. So he's changing kind of who you should actually look to within the religion itself. Many of these people, in particular John Wycliffe, are disgusted by the wealth of the clergy. They see that they've become corrupted. Kind of an adage that we've talked about previously in earlier lectures, specifically at the start of this chapter with the reforms that had to happen in the church. Jan Hus, who is a hero in the Czech Republic today, from Central Europe, he actually taught the Bible was the final authority, not the Pope. So if you look at the Bible and what that says, that's the final authority in matters, not what the Pope says. He actually ends up getting excommunicated from the church, is arrested and tried as a heretic. He's found guilty, and they burn him alive at the stake. All right, so now we're going to move on. Since we talked about some religious issues, we're going to talk about the plague itself, one of the main topics of this lecture. So the plague, what we call the Bubonic Plague or the Black Death, kills 1/3 of Europe's population, at least estimates. So about 25 million people die. Now, if you look on your textbook in page 399, you'll actually see some excerpts from some sources that talks about how society was ripped apart. You can do that. We're also going to look at and read some source material, primary sources from this time describing what the plague did, particularly in the city of Siena. So it's a sad but short, easy read to show you guys that you can connect with. Now, the plague, it did start in Asia and then expanded through trade. And primarily, think back to chapter 12, or think to what we talked about in terms of the Mongols and the connections that you see between East and West because of the Pax Mongolica, the Silk Road trades. The reason why the plague comes from Asia and goes to Europe is because of these trade routes. It follows across these areas. The plague itself, we think of it as typically just it's hitting Europe. It killed millions, if not more, in Asia before it even got to Europe. So it's a significant pandemic that goes across the world. And it's named the Black Death because of the purple or black spots that show up around the wounds and stuff that come up. Now, how does it get into Europe? It gets into Europe by the way of Genovese merchant ships that are trading with the Middle East and coming over and docking in Italian ports. and in a period of 4 years, it spreads all across Europe and does devastating damage. Now, there is a famous nursery rhyme, you guys all know it, that was developed during this period, very dark origins, and you hear a lot of kids singing it when they're young. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's Ring Around the Rosie. If you sing the words, ring around the rosy, pocket full of posies, ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Now, ring around the rosy signifies the red ring that would show up around the black or purple spots. Pocket full of posies was the using of flowers to mask the stench of death, which actually typically, these are doctors, by the way, plague doctors. They would actually shove incense and flowers up into these beaks to deal with the smell. And then ashes, ashes, we all fall down. Those two segments there link to burning the bodies, and then all fall down, society itself plummeting. And there's more to the song, and we'll listen to it in class here after this lecture. Now, here you can see we're going to actually look at two maps, the spread of the Black Death. They're a little bit different, but ultimately you can see where its origins were into Europe, and the Mediterranean islands, the Italian islands, and Corsica, and then into the peninsula, Italian peninsula, up through into France and into Central Europe, and then it spread. Now, there are some areas that are spared based on looking at this map, as well as this one. And primarily, the reason that those areas were spared or had minor outbreaks is they isolated themselves. This is something you can compare to what's going on today with the coronavirus. People trying to isolate themselves to quarantine. And as we're seeing that some areas are more successful than others. But what we're seeing here today, it's more about people being patient or not being patient, or being more willing to accept, hey, I have to do this. And that's a big issue that's going on right now. Now, the effects of the plague. I would start this one. You guys will probably remember all these. It's pretty obvious. Anything and everything that you can think of that would be a negative effect to a pandemic, such as the Black Death, it pretty much comes up during this period. There are some positives that come out of this, and we'll talk about this here in this lecture. And then when we talk about the Renaissance and how the Renaissance actually took place, there are some positives out of the Black Death. Well, the population obviously is the first thing that's going to fall. Trade declines, and when trade declines, you have less people, less buyers in the market, so prices have to rise so that sellers can actually adjust for the loss in customers, which means that serfs have very little access to any outside goods. They need more money to be able to purchase things because the manor system itself is still in place, but it's breaking down and severely during this period and in the centuries before, because of this idea of centralized rule, like in places like England or France, like we've talked about. Now, obviously, the nobility, they're resisting these wage differences from the peasants. And again, this isn't unlike what you're seeing today, just in a little bit of a different form, with some of it being justified by people and others not. So, like, for example, if you have people that are protesting just because they view they've lost rights, such as they can't get a haircut, that's not necessarily the right way. That's not a justified form of resistance. Whereas somebody protesting because they want their job back or opening up of an industry, that's more of a justified resistance in terms of, or protest, that you would see in this example. I'm trying to connect it to what's going on today. In its most basic sense. I'm not trying to pull anybody out here or call anybody out here and make it a controversial thing. I'm just trying to give you guys two examples of what's one that's not necessarily the best reason versus one that's more of one that you can connect to why the peasants would resist or revolt back in the Middle Ages to, like, the need for money because of the rise in prices here. Sorry if that doesn't make any sense. I'm not going with a script here. We talked about this one too previously when we talked about Jews being persecuted. Jews are blamed for the plague in many cases, primarily because they're viewed as outsiders, even though they're monotheistic. They follow a monotheistic faith. It's partially because if you know anything about Jewish communities in terms of when they were spread through their diaspora after being kicked out of the Holy Land and so forth, primarily what Jews did is they would go settle in different places and maintain their own communities. And this was something that was viewed as a lot of people viewed poorly. And it's one of the reasons why Jews themselves are persecuted in these areas, because they're looked at as outsiders and isolated. Think of it in terms of like today, it's more normal for us to like go into a city here, like here in the United States or in other places, and you have like Chinatown or a Little Italy or something like that in New York. That would be like what the Jews would do, is they'd have a Jewish area, and it's much more accepted today to have that kind of segmentation, if you will. Now the church itself loses prestige because many say, look, well, we're praying to God to be saved, and their prayers aren't being answered. And then you also see priests abandoning their duties because of the issues that are going on within the plague itself. People kind of shirk their responsibilities, so the church loses its prestige because it's not. A lot of people think that it's failing them. All right, now we're going to move on, and like I said, we'll read more about the plague and look at some stuff in class, but we're going to move on to the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War marks really the end of medieval Europe, and it's that transition period to the Renaissance. And what ends up happening is Edward III claims the succession to the French throne. If you guys remember, how is he able to do that? It's because of the marriage between the English King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, where that linking between vassal state and so forth comes into play. So, and also that connection with William the Conqueror and so forth. So there's this claim by a British king to the French throne. Well, there's also a claim by the French to their own throne. And it launches a series, what we call the 100 Years' Wars, that lasts much longer than the 100 years. But they're off and on. It's not like a continuous form of warfare. But for the most part, there's wars off and on during this stretch of 1337 to 1453. Now, there's two stages in this war. Early on, the British rule the battlefield. But towards the end, the latter part of the war, the French rally and are able to drive the English out of France, except for one spot, and that's at the port of Calais, which is the area that's right across from England, and the closest area between England and France. Now, there's some significant changes in warfare during this period. The English introduce a new bow. It's called the longbow. It stands about 6 feet tall. Very, very powerful, very accurate, can shoot arrows long distances. And in particular, the English are going to use the longbow to great effect at the battles of Crécy and Agincourt to defeat heavily armored French knights while being outnumbered. The longbow is important. It equalizes the numbers, even though the English are outnumbered by the French knights, because of a couple of reasons. The French had heavily armored knights and used crossbows. Crossbows can be fired very accurately. They're very powerful, but they can take a long time to reload, and the range isn't nearly as long as a longbow. Plus, a longbow can be fired faster. It's much easier to reload, and since you can fire longer distances, it's very powerful. It's strong. It's fast reload. It's very accurate. The English can kind of keep the French knights that are heavily armored at bay and away from them. And they're able to defeat these French forces at, like I said, Crécy, Agincourt, Poitiers, and so forth. And what this ends up doing is this technology, the longbow itself, ends the period of chivalric warfare, like the fighting between knights directly. And it does that because you now have an equalizer that is cheap to make in the bow, and it's very easy to train somebody on it. And you can, it just changes warfare very significantly. Now, and we'll get a little bit more into that in terms of talking about technologies and a little activity that we'll do. Now we're going to move on to Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc is a character that you guys all have probably heard of in history. She's significant. A very powerful female historical figure. Now, Joan of Arc was said to be moved by God and her hearing of voices by God to rescue France from England. She thought she heard the voice of God and or voices of dead saints. Think of it in terms of comparison, in terms of like when we talked early in the year about Muhammad hearing the voice of the Archangel Gabriel and gaining the word of Allah or word of God. Kind of the same thing here. And she wanted the crown to go to King Charles VII, who was French, not to King Henry V, who was British. And she actually works to help establish the French king to the throne. She leads the French to a victory at Orleans in 1429. And with this French victory, it actually leads King Charles to be escorted to Reims in France and crowned the King of France, effectively getting the crown on the head of the proper person, at least in her mind. Now, eventually what ends up happening is she's captured in further fighting. She's put on trial. She's condemned as a witch, primarily linking back to her hearing of voices. And she's burned at the stake, just like Jan Hus, as a heretic. Now, the impact of the war. This is our last slide here. The war ends in 1453. Now, this is significant for a couple of reasons. Remember, 1453 is significant because of it's the fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire. So you have the end, the effective end of the Roman Empire. At this point in history, you see that you have an impact here, that you now have France and England that are going to explode onto or into the world's the world sphere as these dominant powers, or at least the beginning of this. Even though England technically loses the war and France wins, they're going to come out of it ahead, both of them really, in the years moving forward. And this great form of nationalism spreads across England and France. And with that, you see, particularly in France, you have an increase in the power of the monarch and the prestige of the monarch. And that's really where they're going to eventually become this dominant power in Europe. It's going to take some time, over a century or so, but they are eventually going to become this dominant power. Now, England, it's going to take a little bit more time as well, and they will come out of this as this prestige nation and as this nationalistic nation, but they're going to suffer some internal turmoil, and it's going to be fighting over who controls the throne there specifically, and these different houses fight each other, and it's going to be known as the War of the Roses. And we won't talk too much about that here, but if you want to look into it, it's a pretty interesting set of stories. Actually, George R.R. Martin takes a lot of kind of the deceit and instances and examples of that he put into his stories for Game of Thrones. He takes from the War of the Roses. So pretty interesting there, but we just don't have time to talk about this specifically for this course. But this war ends, the 100 Years' War ultimately ends this great religious devotion with people and the connection to the church. On the grand scheme, it doesn't mean that people aren't religious. They are, and still many to this day. It ends that, and then the chivalric period, the code of chivalry, is ended with this. Effectively, the feudal system, the manor system, the looking of the knights, and the chivalric code, and so forth, is gone with the end of the 100 Years' War. All right, guys, that's all I got for you. I know these lectures are a little bit longer than we normally would see. It's just because they're so jam-packed with these big, important events. Please go back through, review these before you take the Chapter 14 test. Hope you enjoyed them. Have a good one.